Hi, the SI meteorologist Paul Dorian here with a brief discussion on space weather, sunspots, and solar imagery. Well, we've talked in other videos about some cycles that occur here on Earth. For example, the Pacific Ocean has a large-scale, longer-term cycle called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, where sea surface temperatures vary from colder than normal to warmer than normal, perhaps over a 20 or 30-year period. There's also some shorter-term cycles with respect to the Pacific Ocean that we've talked about in other videos called El Nino and La Nina, where the tropical sea surface temperatures in the Pacific vary from warmer than normal to colder than normal. Well, the sun itself has some cycles that we can talk about today. One of the cycles that most of us are familiar with is a sunspot cycle, where on average it goes from a solar minimum through a solar maximum back again to a solar minimum in terms of the number of sunspots visible on the sun over about an 11-year period or so. In fact, we have just gone through an extreme solar minimum phase that really began in around 2004, bottomed out in early 2008, and now is headed back towards a solar maximum probably around the middle part of 2013. In addition to sunspots, of course, the sun is important because of some solar flare activity that can occur. In fact, we had a spectacular eruption on the sun just a few days ago. I'd like to show a quick video of that from helioviewer.org. And this occurred earlier this week, June 7th, and right here in this part of the sun you can see a tremendous eruption that occurred, throwing materials out, some of which is actually currently headed towards Earth, and most of it, however, fell back in kind of a mushroom type cloud back towards the surface of the sun. In fact, it appears as if these particles cover about half the surface of the sun on the return back towards the sun. But again, this is a tremendous eruption that occurred on the sun just a few days ago. Now, why are we interested in eruptions like this? Well, these solar flares have been known to affect communication here on Earth as well as satellite performance. In fact, here at the SI, we have been involved with space weather projects over the last several years, specifically trying to assess the potential impact of space weather on satellite performance. Well, as we now look at a still image of the solar eruption that occurred a few days ago, again, we want to emphasize that these kind of solar flares or solar eruptions can affect things on Earth such as communication and satellite performance, and that's why we'll have to monitor the sun at all times. And certainly here at the siweather.com, we'll monitor the sun and periodically show solar imagery, because it has not only an effect on communication and satellite performance on Earth, but of course a major effect on global weather and climate. Well, now let's take a couple minutes to talk about the sunspot cycle and exactly what I mean by solar minimum, solar maximum. Here are a couple images courtesy of NASA of the one on the left shows many sunspots are visible here. This happened to be the solar maximum of around March 2001. And on the right, a solar minimum where very few, if any, sunspots are visible. This happened around the early part of 2005 in that solar minimum that, in many sense of the word, became a historic solar minimum. We had more spotless days during this particular solar minimum that began in 2004 and went until about 2008 or so, more spotless days than any time since 1913, almost 100 years. So there have been some theories that will study this sort of thing, determine that solar minimum of extreme nature like this can certainly have an effect on global temperatures. So this is something we'll monitor over the next several months and years. Again, the sun is crucial to the global weather and climate, and these phases that go from solar minimum to solar maximum can have a tremendous effect on satellite performance, communication, and global weather and climate. Here's another way to look at the recent sunspot cycle activity. The number of sunspots, for example, that go all the way back to 1995. This is a plot courtesy of NASA. This is actually measuring what's called sunspot numbers. It's not all that easy to actually count sunspots. You can imagine that different telescopes, of course, would pick out different numbers of sunspots. So there's a couple different ways to measure sunspots. This is one method out of a couple that determines something called sunspot number. And the main point I want to make out here is we had an uptick back in the late 1990s, reaching a maximum period in this particular cycle around 2000. Now we started to head down in terms of number of sunspots and reached a solar minimum around the beginning part of 2005 that lasted all the way out until about 2009 or so. And this again was a tremendously extensive solar minimum, surprising a lot of solar scientists with the number of spotless days, and perhaps will have a lagging effect on the global climate and local weather conditions. We'll just have to monitor that over the next several months and couple of years. Now we are headed towards a solar max. It looks like the solar max will occur around the middle part of 2013 or so, and there's some theories that suggest that because the minimum was so extensive, it'll actually reduce the solar maximum. In fact, here we have a projection of a solar maximum that is a little bit less intense than the last solar maximum back around 2000-2001. Again, this particular cycle, cycle 24, is expected to peak around 2013 or so, and all this increasing activity, such as what we saw earlier this week with the solar flare, will continue to affect or potentially affect communication and satellite performance here on Earth. So something, of course, we have to monitor. Well, where do we stand right now, the current situation on the sun in terms of sunspots? Again, we're moving away from the solar minimum, headed towards the solar maximum. It doesn't necessarily go straight up from the solar minimum to the maximum, and in fact we had a solar flare earlier this week, but the sun itself is still not all that active right now. There are a couple of sunspots out here. Can you find them? Well, one sunspot is right around here, and another one is right around this region, and there's some resemblance of fading sunspots over in this part of the sun right now. But again, these are cool areas on the sun, sometimes as large as planets, that we'll monitor over the next several months and years to come, because it has all kinds of effect here on Earth. Well, that's it for now. I'm the SI meteorologist, Paul Dorian.